Rated as super severe and dubbed the Mount Everest of caving, the Mossdale Caverns became infamous as the site of England's worst ever caving disaster. Even seasoned cavers shudder at the very mention of Mossdale, and the vast majority refuse to enter, owing to its reputation as one of Britain's, if not the world's, most dangerous caves. Its far reaches have been seen by fewer humans than have stood on the surface of the moon, and on the 24th of June 1967, 10 brave explorers descended into the depths of Mossdale Caverns, leading to a tragic incident that many have compared as England's very own Nutty Putty disaster. This is their story. The Yorkshire Dales are a national park located in the north of England. Sweeping landscapes of wild moorland cover an underlying limestone rock bed that is especially vulnerable to erosion. Over millions of years, this has produced over 2,500 separate caves, making the Yorkshire Dales the most cave-dense area of the United Kingdom. Tourists can visit popular show caves including White Scar or Ingleborough, and the Dales are frequented by a large number of enthusiast caving clubs who are enjoying what is in general a safe sport in caves such as the popular Alum Pot. With the right gear and a bit of common sense, these caves are perfectly safe to visit. The Mossdale Caverns, however, are something entirely different. In the late 1930s, a prominent caver and founding member of the British Speleological Society named Eli Simpson had developed an obsession. Many long-abandoned 19th century lead mines perforated the moors of the Yorkshire Dales, and Simmy had heard rumours that somewhere in those mines was the entrance to Britain's deepest cave. But after a few years of unsuccessfully searching those mines, Simmy's attention was drawn to an interesting geological feature called the Mossdale Scar. About 5 kilometres north of a village called Grassington is an imposing limestone crag known as the Mossdale Scar. A small beck hits its rocky wall and disappears down into the darkness below. All that water disappears somewhere, and Simmy thought the beck may have carved a route deep down under the earth beneath the scar. If England's deepest cave was anywhere, there was a good chance it could be here. And to find this extraordinary cave, he needed an extraordinary caver. Often referred to as the Edmund Hillary of caving, Robert Leakey was renowned for his sheer endurance and skill. Few could keep up with him or his pioneering method of underwater cave exploration that essentially involved just diving down and holding his breath until he found an opening to resurface, something he occasionally did naked. Bob was an early pioneer of British caving. The modern wetsuit wasn't invented till 1952, so he just caved in regular clothing, his only protective gear being a tobacco pipe. Many suspected he was simply just unable to feel cold. Bob was a legend in the caving community, and if there was anyone who could find and chart Britain's deepest cave, it was him. Because this was 1941, most fit young men were taken up fighting in the war, so Bob press-ganged some young women from an aircraft factory he worked at nearby to help him survey the scar. Although they initially had little success, one summer day Bob was sweating from a hard afternoon of scavenging around when he dropped his pipe down a crack beneath the rocks at the base of the scar's wall. Eager to recover it, Bob wedged himself down into that gap and ripped out a few small boulders, realizing he could see water running below. He had accidentally made a small entry point into the same passageway that the stream drops down into. Bob followed that passageway into a pool of water he named the lavatory basin, owing to the fact he was forced to use his trademark method of holding his breath and feeling around the rocks underwater to find a place to resurface further into the cave, and he found that chamber, calling it Assembly Hall. For the first time, someone had found a way into the Mossdale Caverns, and the two men were very eager to find out if this was really Britain's longest and deepest cave. However, these early explorers were completely unprepared for just how dangerous the Mossdale Caverns can be, and it didn't take them long to realise it. Joined by his fellow caver, Lewis Railton, Bob was determined to start mapping out the caverns, and one day as he was doing so, he looked down at some small puddles on the ground, noticing they seemed to be slowly deepening. He made a mental note to keep an eye on it and went back to drawing out his surveys. Only a few minutes passed when Bob again looked up from his notes and suddenly realised the chamber he was sitting in was rapidly filling with water. He dropped everything and scrambled to get out under torrents of water, just making it in time. You see, this is what Mossdale Beck looks like normally. This is what it looks like after heavy rain. And it was quickly realised that when it starts raining on the moors, all that water floods straight down into the Mossdale Caverns, and any caver inside has a very limited time to escape the water before the entrance becomes completely submerged. This cave actually takes in more water than any other cave in Britain. After getting back up to the surface safely, Bob told his assistants about the encounter, and they all refused to enter Mossdale Caverns again. However, there was a good reason why Simi enlisted Bob for this job. Danger was just not a word in his dictionary. Neither was common sense, clearly, but Bob would not let this cave go. For over a year, he painstakingly mapped out as much of the cave system as possible to produce the first survey of Mossdale. And they were right, this was no ordinary cave. The flow of water over thousands of years had carved a labyrinth of over 5 miles of tunnels. Beneath the soft limestone is an impenetrable layer of harder sandstone. The Mossdale Beck has charted an intricate twisting route over that sandstone, going down about 700 foot before resurfacing later in the Dales. As well as dangerous, these caves are also extremely physically challenging, with very few areas where a human can stand upright, entire sections submerged neck deep in water like the ominously named Drown or Glory, where cavers sometimes have to briefly go fully underwater, holding their breath to progress forward, and large sharp rocks cluttering the narrow tunnels, making crawling through sections such as Rough Passage and Knee Wrecker a demanding and exhausting journey. So arduous was that journey, in fact, that Bob only reached the known cave end a single time. Rather than waste the opportunity by leaving the cave to sleep, he dug a little ditch in the sandy mud caverns, laying down and covering himself up to get a few hours of sleep before continuing exploring. Mike Boone, a later prominent explorer of Mossdale, described it like this: "For 20 years, the mere mention of the word was enough to make the potholer shudder with horror. It raised visions of endless jagged crawls, icy canals, froth-coated sumps. Half the time the entrance was underwater, the other half it was blocked. It was the most arduous cave in Britain, demanding almost superhuman endurance, potentially the deepest cave in Britain." This reputation was reinforced when, in 1953, 2 cavers from the Ilkley Pothole Club, Ted Ackroyd and Eric Woodrup, were coming back out of the cave after surveying the far western tunnels, only to realise they were stuck in the first major chamber. Because of how strong the flow of water into the cave had become, they simply couldn't get out. Slowly the water began to rise until they began running out of air. However, the rain stopped just in time and the water did recede. The 2 men would escape alive but exhausted and hypothermic 17 hours after entering the cave. It was a harsh reminder of just how easily death can come unexpected in the Mossdale Caverns. But the true crux of the cave was a passage of tunnels widely regarded as one of the most psychologically demanding sections of caving in Britain, the Marathon. For more than 20 years since the discovery of Mossdale Caverns, only one man had ever braved the Marathon, cementing it and Bob Leakey as legends of British caving. But why was the Marathon so feared? It's an 1,800-foot crawl, a mammoth test of endurance. To Americanise that, that's 6 football fields of crawling on your hands and knees along a tunnel that shrinks to a claustrophobic 45 by 30 centimetres. The marathon is broken into 2 roughly equal-sized crawls separated by a 5-foot chamber, which is pretty much the only time you can fully stand up. Otherwise, crouching into a crab walk is about as high up as you can stand. And this is where we need to talk about why the marathon gets truly terrifying. It wasn't until the 1960s, where as caving across Britain saw a resurgent boom, that cavers began getting interested in exploring Mossdale Caverns again. Modern equipment like neoprene wetsuits meant taking longer excursions deep into caves was much more realistic than in the preceding decades, and a huge lingering question remained, as many, including Bob Leakey himself, believed that what had been mapped to date did not represent the true extent of the cave. They believed that continued much further down. This was an irresistible proposition to many, including the newly formed University of Leeds Speleological Association, who wanted to make a name for themselves by being the club to complete the survey of Mossdale Caverns. And as part of this, in 1963, cavers Mike Boone and Pete Livesey made the first expedition since Bob's original trip 20 years previously, fully through the marathon to Stream End Caves. Mike describes a viscerally horrifying realization he made upon arriving at the marathon. A recent flood coated every nook and cranny in the roof with a slowly disintegrating generating froth mixed with grass blades and clumps of heather. All the low crawls beyond Rough Chamber, 4,000 foot of passage, must have been totally filled up only 5 days before. Anyone in the tunnels at that time would have stood no chance. Many of the existing videos on Mossdale make the claim that the horror of the marathon is that because the tunnel's so narrow, it's impossible to turn back, so once you're in, you're committed for at least an hour of crawling before reaching the midpoint. And though that does make for a nice horrifying detail, it's unfortunately completely false, and it's a fact that's probably been born out of misunderstanding. When Bob Leakey first explored the marathon, he charted a route now known as Leakey's Marathon, which is, yes, horrifyingly tight and difficult. However, a boulder had shifted in the intervening years so that by 1963, Mike and Pete charted a new route, allowing them to take a slightly wider and easier passage called Farm Marathon East. The real inner psychological battle of Mossdale is that for the 1 hour and 30 minutes or so it takes to get through the marathon, you're effectively descending into an unescapable drain. There is only a single exit and entrance that, when it rains heavily, dumps an exceptionally high volume of water straight down into this passage, filling all available airspace. Cavers have described the experience as an overwhelming feeling of sickness. Once you're out of the marathon and in the stream end caves, you can climb up into an area called the high level mud caverns. Because of its higher elevation, you're much more likely to survive minor rain, but just imagine sitting 3 hours deep into a pitch black cave, watching your only exit slowly fill with water, knowing you either go back and risk drowning an hour into that tight crawl, or just sitting watching the water rise up, eventually filling the last air pocket you have. Mike and his fellow cavers ventured into Mossdale in the 1960s to explore the possibility of further opening passages in the stream end caverns that would let the cavers go even deeper into areas unexplored. Various caving associations and clubs would attempt to add to a slowly growing full survey of Mossdale Caverns, and in total between 1960 and 1967, over 400 man-hours of cave exploration was conducted, with 8 separate trips in 1965 alone. And although results looked promising for the cave continuing much deeper, a consensus had been reached that the chokes blocking further exploration could only be passed by bringing explosive charges into the cave. And that takes us to an infamous Saturday in 1967. 26-year-old Dave Adamson was a founding member of the University of Leeds Speleological Association and a key surveyor who was involved in a good number of those 400 hours of exploration in Mossdale. On the 24th of May, he would lead a team of 10 cavers into Mossdale Caverns, with his co-lead on this expedition being the 24-year-old Jeffrey Warreau. Jeff had some serious experience using gelignite to force boulders out of choke points to expand cave passageways, so together these two highly experienced cavers wanted to be the first to enter those hitherto unknown regions by blasting through the tight chokes and get their names attached to those passageways, potentially some of the deepest in Britain, something that would certainly make the still young ULSA a force in the British caving scene. To help achieve this mission, Dave and Jeff enlisted the help of 4 more experienced cavers: 19-year-old William Frakes, 20-year-old John Ogden, 23-year-old Colin Vickers, and the youngest of the group, 17-year-old Michael Ryan. The team were also going to be joined that day by another 4 amateur cavers who were attending on more of a sightseeing tour to some of the easier passageways, including Dave Adamson's 22-year-old fiancée, Morag Forbes. In fact, Dave and Morag were due to get married only 6 weeks later. The morning of Saturday 24th of June, the party of 10 entered the Mossdale Caverns system at 2 PM in the afternoon. The water level in the cave was well below normal and the moors did appear dry. However, at least one member of the team, Jim Cunningham, was worried. He had read a news forecast predicting a chance of scattered thunderstorms on the Dales later in the day. Because of this, he had walked through the Mossdale Beck and noticed the river did seem a little bit higher than usual. He had a word with Dave, who reassured him that everything would be fine, and he trusted Dave's expert opinion on this matter, so the 10 cavers descended. They immediately split up, with the surveying team clad in protective gear and wetsuits moving at a much faster pace, but it's still initially taking the same route. The sightseers took a much more relaxed pace to enjoy the otherworldly experience of the Mossdale Caverns, dropping down under the Drown or Glory through the larger boulder hall down to Rough Chamber by about 3:30, whereas the faster surveying team had already begun their progress into near marathon. As I've said previously, this was the point where further progress gets significantly more difficult, so the 4 4 less experienced cavers, especially considering that the 2 girls had no wetsuits, turned back to finish off their journey. They safely arrived back on the surface at 5 PM, where the sky was overcast and raining slightly. Morag was a little bit worried about this, but the conditions didn't appear to give any major cause for concern. They returned back to their base at the nearby Gilnick shooting hut, where they ate and changed clothes. Jim Collette and John Shepherd left for the night. Morag, however, decided she would remain until Dave and the remaining cavers returned. Around this point, they had progressed much deeper, making the arduous journey through both the near and far marathon crawls before squeezing out into the larger stream end cave for a break to eat, no doubt also tired after making the long journey so deep into the cave. By this time, they'll have been crawling for around about 3 hours. Then Dave and Jeff began placing their explosive charges. After these were detonated, the cavers planned to leave and begin the long journey back to the surface to explore the new areas on a second trip on a later date. Up on the surface and getting a bit restless, Morag then made another trip to the Scar at about 7:30, finding little difference in the water conditions. Over the coming hours, Morag noticed the rain beginning to fall increasingly heavily, and fearing for the safety of the still underground cavers, she returned to the Scar at roughly 9 PM. What she saw was horrifying. The entire base of the Scar was now a lake, and the entrance was nowhere in sight. Morag knew her husband and his team needed help desperately. She ran almost a mile across the moors to the nearby Gill House farm, found it deserted, so ran another 1.5 miles to Yarnbury. A local resident, Mr. Riley, met her and drove Morag to a phone to call out rescue organisers. The call for assistance was received at about 11:10, first by the Upper Wharfdale Fell rescue team, who immediately dispatched an advanced party by Land Rover to the Scar, alerting the cave rescue organisation on a standby basis and requesting the fire brigade send pumps and units. Both the fire department, CRO and Leeds University Club immediately mobilised. The first responders from the Fell team arriving at about 1:15 AM. By this point, the entrance was under around 4 foot of water, and within 45 minutes they had begun attempting to divert the raging torrent. A small dam successfully enabled an advance party to enter the cave and reach the assembly hall at about 2:30. However, the Drown or Glory was completely impassable. Desperate to reduce the water level, the fire department deployed between 8 and 12 water pumps to divert water past the Scar by about 3:30, but this was just having little to no effect on the levels inside the cave. Hours were passing and the water had not dropped one bit. The incident commander made the decision at 5 AM to call in heavy digging equipment, a JCB loaned by a local farmer, to divert the entire Mossdale Beck using an 8-foot deep, 130-yard trench with a significantly reinforced dam to prevent any further water entering. Along with nearly 300 cavers, rescuers and support staff, a Herculean effort to build a reinforced dam was undertaken. Even so, it wasn't until 8 AM on Sunday, 9 hours after the initial call was received, that the water levels were successfully diverted, enough to enable rescuers to get beyond the assembly hall and actually into the cave. At this point, there were 2 possible scenarios of where the party could have safely gained refuge. The first was in Rough Chamber, roughly midway down the cave system. The first teams descended down into the cavern and were able to get down as far as Rough Chamber. Unfortunately, no sign of the party was found, and a strong stream was still flowing down the normally dry rough passage. There was still hope that the second scenario was true, that the 6 cavers were just waiting safely up on the higher levels of the mud caverns. But those more experienced with the cave were very concerned. As the rescuers were progressing, they routinely had to stop to move foam out of the way. They knew the passage had been flooded to the roof. This was a huge flash flood, and no air had been left in the cave so far. It wasn't for another 5 painstaking hours that the level of water fell enough to enable rescuers to progress beyond the rough chamber. At this point, 2 teams of 6 men were in the cave, who continued scouring the tunnels, supported by a telephone that ran as deep as rough chamber. As Tony Waltham, one of the 6 rescuers, proceeded down near Marathon, he found an Oldham accumulator, a large battery on the floor. From a forensic perspective, the manner in which it was found was very important. Attached to the battery was a long wire that had gotten caught in an outcropping on the ground. Tony immediately knew this meant a huge wall of water had hit the tunnel, flooding it in mere minutes and nearly taking this battery with it. But in fact, as the first rescue team crawled their way down, they started getting increasingly confident about finding the men alive. Although a huge flood was evident, they were now only a few minutes crawl from the squeeze that led into the high-level mud caverns, and they even started calling out the names of the men, expecting to hear a response. And shortly after 5:30, that line rang back on the surface. 5 of the 6 men had been located. Rewinding back to around 8 PM on Saturday, the 6 men had just finished setting their charges and began to make their way back out of the cave and into the far marathon led by Jeff and Michael. Around 20 minutes or so into their journey, something was taking place further up the stream. As the large volume of water flooded the cave entrance, the regular route that the water takes, called Siphon Passage, became completely overwhelmed and backlogged. Water then diverted, filling up the nearby chambers completely before unleashing straight down the marathon. The men would have heard an almost jet engine-like sound coming towards them moments before a wave smacked straight into them. Very quickly, the small tunnel filled up from floor to ceiling, the fast flow blocking the men from progressing any further as it got increasingly difficult to find space to breathe. The men would have desperately tried to wedge themselves up in any crevice of the roof possible to escape the rising water, but there was simply too much. Shortly before 6 PM on Sunday evening, Tony's rescue team turned a corner, seeing 4 legs. After a preliminary search, they found 5 bodies. The message was relayed: turn back, they're all dead. All the evidence suggested that they had drowned shortly after entering Far Marathon on the return journey to the surface. However, there was no time for the rescuers to relax. Many of the team were openly weeping with emotion or retching with fear. As they sat debating whether they would be able to take the bodies out, rescuer Jim Eyre got on the phone to inform the surface teams. After a brief discussion, he turned and told his fellow rescuers, "No, we need to get out. They're telling me the cave might flood again." A new thunderstorm was forming in the area and the dam was already beginning to break down. The team rushed back to the surface and realized that water had just begun to spill over back into the cave. Twice already, the dam had failed. Surface rescuers were just physically blocking gaps in the dam with their body, standing in the freezing water. It just wasn't safe for anyone to remain underground. As the team got debriefing, it was then realized they had made a mistake. They were still missing a 6th caver, John Ogden. However, there was no question of continuing searching at this point. The thunderstorm lasted throughout the entire night, breaching and damaging the dam in 2 separate locations. A huge number of cavers had also been working for over 24 hours at this point without rest, and there was a shortage of cave-ready rescuers who actually knew the interior layout well enough to even mount a search. A brief attempt was made on Monday to go down and find Oggy, but the quantity of water that fell continuously threatened the lives of anyone who went back into the cave. The team had to withdraw as the now 6-foot dam was again in serious danger of collapsing as rain continued to fall throughout the day. It was held up at one point by a JCB tractor, which was itself stuck in a thick bog of 2 foot of water. A human chain ferried sandbags to the top of the dam, hastily filled by hand, desperately trying to stop the ever-rising water from breaching the top and swamping the pumps. All underground rescuers had to evacuate. By Tuesday evening, a second 10-foot tall dam structure was being constructed, aided by higher quality sandbags provided by army engineers. Search parties now could get back in the cave and they worked all day, by 4:30 identifying the first 5 bodies. But it wasn't until a team descended at 10 PM with instructions to search the minor side passages that opened off the marathon that Oggy would be located. Just after 3 AM on Wednesday morning, rescuer Brian Boardman reported he found John Ogden. He was jammed vertically into an extremely tight rift a mere 15 foot from the other 3 bodies. He was jammed so high up and covered with silt that only his boots and a bit of his white helmet were visible. Being the last in the tunnel, it's likely he had the most time to try and wedge himself up in the cave ceiling to try and get away from the water. By 5 PM on Wednesday, the coroner arrived. Despite initially there being strong conviction among the rescuers to try and move the bodies to an area of the cave where they could be buried, the coroner prohibited any further entrances of the cave. Under heavy protest from the caving community, a boulder obstruction was ordered by the police, and by request of the landowner, the dam and diversion were removed as water was streaming onto adjacent land. The Mossdale Caverns were officially sealed, becoming the final tomb for those 6 men. The official cause of death was ruled by a jury as drowning as a result of misadventure. Fast forward to over 50 years later in present day, and the cave is no longer physically or legally sealed. In 1971, friends of the deceased cavers went back on a particularly painful journey where they successfully gave the 6 men a more fitting final resting place by moving the bodies and burying them in the mud caverns, where they'd be safe from all but the most severe of storms, and a small monument on the moor above denotes the exact spot underground that they're buried. The Mossdale Scar is a crumbling crag of soft limestone, so it constantly changes and rocks fall off. It's never going to be possible to entirely seal it. No one is there to stop anyone from entering. I don't think many people still do, except for two very notable exceptions. Simon Beck and Alex Ritchie have both been down many times since, and if you've watched any videos on Mossdale, including this one, you will have seen their footage, as along with a few short videos by Adele Wald, they are really the only people to date who have made footage of the inside of the caves publicly viewable on YouTube. Both were kind enough to provide permission for me to use their footage, as well as to give some guidance by clarifying aspects of the story that you would only know by going down into the cave. Alex has been down 8 times and Simon over a staggering 100 times, many of them completely on his own. Both have documented the cave extensively on YouTube, but also from Simon in written form, which really helps you get a sense of both what it's like and why people go down to places like Mossdale. I'd highly recommend at least reading Simon's Marathon Obsession, which ends with the foreboding yet telling. There is no light at the end of this tunnel, only darkness. The only light is what you bring, and the deeper you go, the darker it gets. But with the right eyes, you can see the light that comes with seeking the dark. Alex has described caving as the last true exploration on Earth, a chance to see something that perhaps no human has ever laid eyes on. To this day, the question remains of just how much more of Mossdale Caverns there is to explore. It's what brought them both back to the caverns despite its fearsome reputation. I asked Alex how he deals with knowing about the cave's history, and he told me he pays very good attention to the weather reports and primarily only visits in the spring or autumn where storms are much less frequent, but he still feels it's a little spooky down in Far Marathon, imagining what it must have been like in that crawl when the flood came. Down in Mossdale, the water bounces eerily around the caves, at times sounding like people talking in the distance. I'd also just like to make a final note that both men mentioned they don't go into the northern high-level mud caverns where the 1967 team were buried out of respect. Mick Melvin, who attended the rescue efforts, compiled the very useful and important document of primary sources about the disaster on which this video has leaned heavily to accurately recall the events of Mossdale, and all credit goes to him in this regard. Without that, I don't think it's possible to make a respectful and accurate video about the 1967 incident at all. In 2017, in commemoration of the 50th anniversary, Melvin also organised a service at the nearby St Mary's Church, and in attendance was Rachel Taylor, the daughter of Colin Vickers, the only one of the 6 men who had a child at the time he died. The Upper Wharfdale Fell Rescue Association, who were the first boots on the ground at the disaster, brought her to the cave for the first time in 2014 to help her pay respects to her father. They are a charity that gets no government funding and needs over £50,000 annually to continue rescuing those in need on or under the Dales. And if you enjoyed the video, please consider contributing to my fundraiser to support their work in memory of the 6 cavers by visiting the pinned comment below. If anyone else is ever in danger 5 miles deep under the Yorkshire Dales, these are the guys who will be there, whatever time of day. And I'd like to finally finish the video off with a quote from Dave Adamson's mother. I have managed to keep a sane view on Mossdale by asking myself, what would David wish me to do about his interests? Would he have wanted to keep others out? Would he want to deter others from gaining the knowledge that he sought? I know he would say carry on, and the lessons learned, apply them. This was the Crux Files, and goodbye for now.